GM friends, and welcome to the future of gaming. You're listening to our weekly blockchain gaming rollup. It is today the 12th of August 2022. We've got Philip Collins, we've got Devin Becker, and we've got myself, Nico Vereecke. We are discussing first, I recently shared content worth consuming, a research paper on tokenomics, and there's some things I learned in there. There's a lot of good stuff in there, one of which we want to discuss. It's about tokenomics and allocations, token allocations. Then Splinterlands does something with sports. Then we're discussing what is an NFT and what the hell does it have to do with ownership. Devin's going to give us a rundown there. We're also talking about the Tornado Cash sanctions, USDC frozen, and we're talking about Axie that introduces Season 0 of Origin. And if we have some time, there's some other smaller topics we can touch upon. All right, let's start. So tokenomics. So the research paper I shared is a research paper written for a game. It's a game built by Star Chain Gazers, which is a French-based blockchain gaming company. And so the founder, who is part of the VogDAO, shout out to Dan, he worked with like some computer science professors and economy professors, finance professors to actually like build a research paper about the best practices in both first DeFi and then blockchain gaming, and then distill all of those and take it into like what they're designing around their game. And as a part of that, they looked at tokenomics and like more specifically how tokens are distributed amongst stakeholders in like an ecosystem. And so if you looked at a white paper or like even a website where they talk about their tokenomics, you will remember like a pie chart where you have like X% goes to the team, then you have like a bit of percent going to founders, to advisors, maybe investors, and then like community, and then liquidity providing and stuff like that. In-game rewards is also usually there, and so a lot of people take that as at face value, where they're like, oh, the team gets 20%, and so that's like they get 20%. But in reality, if you ever studied finance or like or something related to that, you'll know that if like in finance, money you can get today is worth more than money you can get tomorrow. So, because there's an opportunity cost, you could have like reinvested money. You always prefer to have something today than in a point in the future, because you don't know what's going to happen in between. And so essentially they proposed, and this probably like might make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but I learned this, okay? So anyway, so what they proposed was you need to discount the tokens that are emitted over time with a certain time factor. But discounting them, so essentially some tokens are like vested, some tokens are emitted over a bunch of time, some tokens are only like released after maybe 2 years and then they start emitting, right? So you have like vesting schedules and cliffs. Anyway, and so depending on that, the token allocation might actually look very different. So one hypothetical example is there's a TGE, which is a token generating event, which means like the Genesis smart contract gets created, right? And from that moment on, you start, vesting and counting towards people's like unlock schedules. And so, for example, if you have a game where the game's out in 2 years, let's say, and from year 2, then the game, the tokens get emitted within the game as like play to earn rewards or whatever you want to call it. Let's say that you have so from year 2, you start emitting those tokens, those reward tokens, let's say over 5 years. So it's going to take from point 0, it's going to take 7 years to emit them all. If you compare that to some unlock schedules for founders and a team, for example, it might be that it starts vesting after 1 year, and it only takes 2 years for all of these tokens to be fully emitted. And so if you calculate after 7 years, if you discount the rate or like the time it takes for tokens to get unlocked, in reality, the founders actually get a way larger part of that pie than you would initially think, because their tokens get unlocked earlier. Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's something I found interesting. And in general, that tokenomics paper is really great to read. There's a lot of concepts that they go over in DeFi and blockchain gaming that are useful to like get a refresher on if you might need one.
And so is a big part of that, I haven't had a chance to go through the full paper yet, basically like a risk premium to the founders or the players that are there earlier, where the discount is effectively giving you a larger share because it's almost vesting over a longer period of time?
The conclusion is more like that some people tend to forget that the real token distribution is depending on when they unlock. right? And so it's more of a look. Take these vesting schedules into account when you act, like before you make any conclusions about token distributions, right? Again, like people are used to looking at that pie and be like, oh, 20% goes to the team, 5% to advisors. That's fair. So it's like it's check. Like tokenomics are good enough for me to like consider this as something I'd get into, right? But you actually need to dig a bit deeper and also look at the unlock schedules from each party to figure out like the effective token distribution.
Yeah, it's also something that varies over time, like because people treat the token differently. So like when you're say you're allocating to liquidity, right? That might mean you're allocating that to, say, an AMM, which is not guaranteeing that that's in anyone's pocket. It's sitting on an AMM, as opposed to like an exchange where people are exchanging directly from one to another. So like sitting in an AMM is not necessarily reflecting the supply the same way as, say, sitting in someone's pocket, or also the same way as when tokens vest. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but isn't basically just as soon as tokens vest, sell. You just sell them, basically. They just hit the market for the most part, especially because, like as Phil was saying about the idea of a premium, the sooner you could sell a token, since the token values generally go down, you are getting a premium by getting it earlier. Not just off the future discount, but off the idea that it is probably going to go down in price. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you unlock, you create a huge amount of sell pressure. Because it goes from like, let's say people are kind of selling like this, like this slight incline as people are earning, and maybe the game's growing or shrinking, so that affects it a little bit. But then as soon as like a big unlock happens and all those people sell, that's a big jump. And that's a lot of sell pressure all of a sudden. And if people react emotionally, they could just like all of a sudden be like, oh my God, the game's going to crash, and panic sell, and it could like domino effect and stuff like that. So it's just like, there's a lot of these different factors that's like, and I think basically kind of the point, essentially what you're making, Nico, is that you can't just look at a chart and be like, this is what the token's going to do over time, because there's all these different factors that hit at different times with different kinds of pressures, different kinds of actual like supply flow, like in where the tokens is and how it's moving around kind of in the financial plumbing. And that all of that has effects on different areas, including the game, the markets, the AMMs, the players themselves, all that stuff.
And it makes a lot of sense too, because again, we haven't really seen what that reckoning day looks like when tokens do unlock. For most relevant projects today, token unlocks are, over the coming years. And so planning ahead for this is going to be important. Even for the best content, there can be massive market moving pricing pressures that take place. Even if you are a successful game, if 10, 15, 20, 30% of your token supply is owned by investors that are going to seek liquidity when their lockup ends, I mean, there definitely needs to be structures put in place now with that in mind, that no matter how successful your game is as a game, there are going to be significant sell pressures at some point.
Yeah. I mean, it sucks because it's like, imagine if you issue stock in your company as your way of like, repaying the investors, and then immediately their instinct is, as soon as like their stock's able to vest, they just sell immediately. And like, that's not going to look great for your stock, right? Like no matter who you are, like that's going to look bad. And it's one of those problematic things that we've kind of set up for ourselves with the way we've done all this token based sort of investment reimbursement essentially for these things. And it's like, it's weird, because it's like, we take a bunch of IOU fake money that we make up as tokens, and we go, well, cool, like you can cash in this IOU fake money as soon as like, a year's up or 2 years or whatever it is. But you're not actually going to cash it out from me. I'm not going to give you any of it. You're going to cash it out from the players. So you're going to go to the players and ask for your investment back. And that, when you think about it, that is kind of weird.
Yeah. And what you said, Devin, about, once investors are vested, they immediately get out. There's kind of like game theory behind this, where if you're like, the thing is that investors usually unlock simultaneously, right? Like there's usually, like, as an investor, you don't want to get into like an emission schedule where some investors have like a better unlock schedule or like an earlier unlock schedule. So anyway, there's usually a bunch of investors involved in any one project, and so once tokens get unlocked, you don't want to be the one holding the bag, right? And so essentially there's massive pressure for everyone to sell at the same time. So
Yeah.
I think it's fair to assume that once tokens get unlocked for investors, they get out. Although they might be like believing in the project on the longer term, but they're almost
Hopefully.
forced because like they cannot or they should not if they have like limited partners that they have to like explain their actions to, then you can't be holding the bag if every other investor sells, which is
Right.
going to result because of game theory dynamics into everyone selling whenever they can. And so I think for that I'm always in favor of like very well designed and like unlock schedules where it's like and assuming that once tokens get unlocked they will be dumped, and so basically like make sure that your unlock happens after the game is out and when there's like when you plan for some demand, and maybe you try to time like certain game releases with these unlock schedules and stuff, so that way there is extra demand to buffer a bit for the extra supply that will.
I'll be honest, the VC investment method when it comes to tokens and stuff just makes no sense to me. You take a bunch of money and you almost guarantee you're going to lose it by investing it, because I haven't seen a game design yet where there's actually reason to believe the token value will go up over more than like a month. Like there's no long-term value to increase the price. Like there could be long-term value in terms of people sticking around and playing, but what is the demand that's going to be so absolutely insane that the game is actually going to go up in price after initial demand, where like there's the demand spike at the beginning, right? Where like the initial growth, like what initial growth cycle do you see where it's like, oh, it goes up and then plateaus for a minute, but then it goes up even more and then plateaus, goes up even more. It's always like there's one spike, maybe two, but it almost always goes down. So it just feels like you're investing money that you could be investing in something that's more likely to actually come back with a return than something where you're like, well, it's probably going to come back. And you're basically risking your discount. So it's like, let's say you got in at like essentially 6 cents worth, and like the initial price is like $1, and you're like, okay, I just got to be able to sell this before it hits 6 cents or lower. Like you're just racing that discount that you got, basically. And I don't know, like I'm not a VC, so it's just, to me, like it feels kind of crazy. But if you want to give me some money, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, it's especially interesting because so many of these tokens prices are artificially inflated today. And there's plenty of $1 billion+ projects that aren't $1 billion IPs. And once that initial sell pressure hits and that first dip happens, I think there is a good chance that a lot of those never go back up. And so, like, if you don't get out first, to Nico's point on the mental exercise of, if everyone's getting out, I just have to dump too, and just kind of go along with the crowd. I do think there is a risk where you are answering to your LPs of, all those people got out at, 750, 800, 900 million. Why are you getting down at 400 million?
But we believe in it.
Yeah. So I think there's going to be at some point the lockups are going to end. These tokens are going to be hit by sell pressure, and maybe that's what takes them to their more intrinsic value. But I think we're still a little ways off from seeing what that looks like. But it's going to be, I think it'll be a pretty painful period for a lot of these tokens.
I think it's honestly still a relic of us trying to take DeFi and ICO kind of stuff and apply it to games, and I don't think it totally makes sense for games. Like, just even this idea of these token distribution schedules, investing schedules, like all the stuff that we do right now is just kind of copy and pasted from earlier stuff, but we don't really actually question, does this even make sense for games? To have these kind of economic systems designed in a way that's like, that's not how game systems work. That's not how game economies work. It's such a different thing, like tacked on top, that I want to pause and be like, does this even make sense? Should we even be doing it like this? Should we even say there's a cap on it and this is how we're going to get to the cap, and trying to treat it like it's Bitcoin or something? And that's not really how it functions. And it's certainly not how it's distributed with play to earn models and stuff like that. It's not really proof of work in the sense that Bitcoin is, right? And it's certainly not proof of stake in the way that Ethereum is going to be, hopefully next month.
So do you guys think 2 years from now every single game is going to have its own token? Or do you think we eventually move away from this model?
I think we move away from the model.
That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Interesting. So, Devin, I agree. I think there's a lot of looking around and like, oh, all of these teams have done this, so I guess I need to do this too. Which
I get that with staking a lot.
Exactly.
Everyone else
So
is doing it,
staking
so why
is one
shouldn't we
example.
do it?
Yeah, and then another example for me is like rarities in NFTs. Like, oh, we're going to sell like, let's say between 5,000 and 20,000 NFTs, and then they have to have different rarity levels, right? And so that's another, thing that happens, especially within games, which I like are, in my opinion, is stupid for at least makes it hard for you to design good games. Might get people to trade the assets and gives you some royalty revenue stream, but doesn't really help you in the long term, in my opinion, right? And so I agree that there's a lot of looking around and like, okay, these seem to be the best practices, so I guess we need to do this. And also, this for me, a lot of this boils down to the fact that everyone in the market is essentially like the same 100,000 people who are just flipping NFTs and tokens to each other in a big Ponzi scheme, just because no one is actually going to want to play this game, and we're all banking on all the other
It's hot
people
potato.
actually wanting to. Exactly. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And so my point is, all these 100,000 people are used to certain things, right? They're used to having a token with a fixed supply. No one wants to hold a token that doesn't have a fixed supply, man, because you never know, hyperinflation. That's why we're into Bitcoin, man. We don't want that. Anyway, so I agree that there's a lot of things being done that are just like, that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. That being said, I think, good token design and I think, for me, what this whole Web3 thing does, having your own token and designing a game that implements this token does, it's essentially a new way to set up a company, where traditionally a company is where all of the money goes into, right? All of the value created by a game goes into the company. And so now you're essentially like introducing a token, and it is it's another thing that can actually hold value. And so the question that you had, Devin, is, as far as you're concerned, there's never any value created in any of these games, and I think that's maybe a fair assessment for many of the current games, right? But from our perspective as an investor, I think I believe that there's going to be, like, in 5 years there will be Web3 games that are more valuable than like many of the games itself, or many of the companies that we know today, like maybe not even an Activision, Blizzard, and EA, etc.
Right.
Tens of billions or maybe hundreds of billions,
like Zynga was to
worth
Facebook
value.
gaming, right? Like, absolutely.
So and so my point, so I think if you design your tokenomics where that players will need X amount of the tokens on average to be able to participate in a game, have enough liquidity to buy and sell items and like have fun, then as the player amount grows, each of them on average will need X amount of tokens, then you will have that amount of demand. Given the supply dynamics, you can actually calculate a bit like the price, like a fair price should be around this, and then you can use other mechanics to actually like start pegging the value of the tokens. So like you can make it so that the price to get into the game would be like maybe $20, right? And you could design it in such a way, as the player base grows, you get more supply into the game, and then you can, so there's a lot to be done there.
If you could accurately predict that, you might also be able to predict lottery numbers, because like that is a huge ask.
You cannot predict it. I agree. Like, I'm just saying
that.
that.
In theory, though, I totally agree with you. And I've thought a lot about this idea of how do we try and match supply to demand in a dynamic way that makes sense. And it's so hard because, like, the more I thought about it, the more there's any kind of lag, it causes problems. But if there's no lag, it also causes problems. So you end up with this weird area where you've got to like dynamically balance, slightly forecast, and adjust things and I don't know the answer to it at all, but like it's a really interesting problem of how do you try and match supply to demand. And you ask all the supply chains in the world because they're running through the same problems, right? Like the real world has this problem constantly. How do we match supply to demand? And you think in the digital space it should be a lot easier than the physical space, right? Because you don't have manufacturing delay times and all that stuff. Like you want a coin, boom, it's minted, right? But it's still like even with that instant sort of like ability to adjust, it's so tricky to like in real time adjust to that, and whoever solves that is going to be like amazing. Like I hope someone does solve that because it's such a crazy problem, but such an important problem to solve, right? If people do want to keep using tokens, but I think part of the problem with all this too is like we're trying to put the cart before the horse, and that no one's actually figuring out the revenue models for their game, and they're just assuming tokens are that. And I think that's an underlying problem that's like putting this on shaky foundation, where like you might be trying to solve the supply problem, but you haven't even figured out what underpins the value of your company and underpins the value of your token outside of demand. And in the sense of like, well, people need this to do X. Like that's everyone's answer for why demand exists is you need it to do this.
Is that a wrong answer?
No, it's not a wrong answer. It's just we don't have anything underpinning that. Like it's like this.
If the game's fun,
right?
Which all future blockchain games are, because they know that current blockchain games are not fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build fun games. It's really easy, actually.
Fun first, and then you're fine.
Listen to me. Yeah.
I mean, I agree that like there are obviously like you can underpin certain value with utility value in the sense of like this is fun. I'm going to keep driving towards that, but because it's not actually money involved in a lot of this, it's token exchanges. It's like right now, if you take potential future in-app purchases like on app stores out of the equation, right now people aren't putting actual money into the games. They're trading money for other things that they're trading for other things. It's like if I went and traded money for like bottle caps and traded that for seashells, and then the seashells are the currency of your game, and you're like, cool, I'm collecting seashells, and then as soon as I need money for my company, I'm going to go trade these seashells back for money. Like that's kind of what we're building right now, and it's like maybe that works in the short term, but in the long term, I think it needs to be maybe a little bit more thought out. And I think it's a cool experiment. Don't get me wrong.
The problem is seashells price is always constantly changing too, so you have no real visibility into
the tide goes out.
Your actual fiat value of the revenue that you're generating, unless you're swapping at the time of receipt.
Right.
Can I put my Bitcoin hat on and just say that we always price things in dollars, right? But the value of dollars and the shit you can buy with dollars goes down all the time as well. So we're using like a changing ruler to measure stuff anyways.
True.
And so my thesis, it would not surprise me if in 30 years we're using Bitcoin to price things, because that's actually like the only thing that has a like truly fixed supply.
I ran into that problem. So doing a lot of the tokenomics stuff that you were talking about, like these distribution schedules and stuff like that I've done for clients, it's always really interesting to even try and like explain to them like the variables that are like arbitrary and how everything has to be relative values stuff. So like, for example, token price, like every time I ask them like, okay, what do you think the token price should be? It's just blank stares. Like no one knows. And it's such an arbitrary value. It's like it almost ends up being like a weird denomination thing where it's like, let's say something like you're like, okay, cool, it'll cost 5 of my token to do this in the game. It's like, okay, well then how much should that cost? Okay, well then I can divide that by 5. But if you don't even know how much things in your game are going to cost and you don't know what they're worth, both of those things are totally relative values, and you just have to like at some point like throw a dart at one and be like, that's what I'm going to do for that value, and then all the rest of the spreadsheet calculates. And it becomes so hard because how do you say what a token's worth? Because it's like it's almost like how divisible do you make it, or how many numbers do you want after the 0 or on the other side of the 0? And it's like I'm starting to wonder if like I want to start investigating, is there a psychology behind this where you can actually try and derive the math of dividing your token up in terms of the supply and fungibility and stuff, like so that psychologically the number is appealing to people, like because if it's such an arbitrary value. Right,
well, that's the. I feel like that is the psychology that's been used since it's been so speculative so far. Is get the price as low as possible so people can buy as many tokens as possible.
Right.
And out of their 1 billion trillion supply, I own 1 billion tokens.
Right.
And then you anchor low and say, oh, if this goes to $1, I'm a billionaire.
Right. And I think maybe it's penny stocks all day.
Yeah, I think there's the psychology of all it needs to do is get to 50 cents, $1, and I'm just ultra rich overnight. And like having 1 billion of any kind of token feels good, even if it's 0.0001% of the supply.
Yeah, and maybe that is the psychology. Is like that you want the price number to be low and you want the quantity number to be high, and that just feels good. So you try and go for that.
Just
make your token as low
supply. Just ignore it.
Make your supply insane, and just everyone has $1 billion, but everything costs $1 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. I mean, that being said, like I've looked at tokens, seen that their price is below 1 cent, and like, oh, this is a I don't know, like a penny, like the same thing as a penny stock, but then in the crypto world, I guess. So I guess there's good token design there. So what I like, and you'll find this in the research paper that we started this conversation with, is thinking about our token will be priced in such a way that this beginner package to have some advantage, it's priced in such a way that the prices of assets within the game are similar to best practices within the current free-to-play world, where your beginner package is going to be $3, right? And then you get people to actually start spending.
As in
money
3 tokens or $3 US?
No, so the beginner. So I guess then the amount of tokens either is flexible or the price is
right, and that becomes hard. It's like you have to peg it differently depending on whether or not you want a fixed dollar price or you want a fixed token amount. And then if it's a fixed token amount, then if the dollar price fluctuates, you're now like, and that's a problem I've dealt with too. Is like when you have to peg stuff, which way do you peg it? Right? Which way do you decide on a value, or is everything floating? And if everything's floating, then no one can ever calculate anything, right? So something has to be fixed. You have to have some kind of concrete value that anchors everything else. And that's why we have stuff, like stable coins as like this important peg and other stuff like that. And the nice thing about all this stuff is, and I think you've said this before, is it just makes everyone really rethink and learn money. Like learn financial stuff in a way that we weren't really forced to as much before, and like forcing this really understanding of like what is the fundamental underpinning of money, what is the value of exchange, why does supply and demand affect things, like just really thinking through all these things in a way, because when everything's digital and arbitrary, like you kind of have to understand it, otherwise you're just kind of blindly walking around hoping that like things work out. And I feel like we've got a good mix of that right now, where some people understand and a lot of people are kind of walking around blindly. But it's very interesting to like really, as a society, be like globally experimenting with money in such a radical way that we never could before globally, because it was always this like localized thing before. And like maybe you could have exchanges and bigger trading and it expanded over time. But now we've got this truly global instant forms of money on demand that are designed instead of sort of like organically growing and through trade and things like that. It's so weird to see, like, and I mean, I hope it results in us ending up in some sort of Star Trek future where we just don't even use money anymore, but I think that might be a ways off.
Yep, totally. Good. Should we move on to the next topic, because we've been talking?
I think that one leads into some good topics like tornado cash.
Actually, rethinking money. Let's do that one. So, this week was kind of bad for the privacy nerds out there, which I don't know if I'm one yet. I still have to figure it out. Anyway, so what happened? So, Tornado Cash. So, a number of wallets involved with Tornado Cash were sanctioned. Now, what is Tornado Cash? Tornado Cash is a set of smart contracts where you can, from one address, you put in a number of tokens. So these could be ETH, these could be USDC, and then you use other accounts but like a bunch of people do it together. So let's say 10 different people put in 100 ETH each. So you have 1,000 ETH, and then from 100 different addresses, they take out 10 ETH each. And so there's 1,000 going in, a little bit less than 1,000 going out, because obviously there's a fee. But then at that point, you don't know who owns what, right? You don't know which person belonged to which original address. And it was essentially like a privacy or a mixer, like a privacy tool or a mixer that was being used. And so it's, a lot of scams and rug pulls were actually involved with this, where I think even the Sky Mavis hack, I think
Yes, a lot of these hacks, they've at least partially tried to go through Tornado Cash for stuff.
Yeah, basically, Tornado Cash is essentially like a money laundering machine, right? It's, and so the Treasury, U.S. Treasury, actually agrees with me when I say this, and they were like, everyone who used, or these addresses who used Tornado Cash, we're going to put them on the sanction list. And sanction list means that no U.S. entities are allowed to interact or allow like transactions from any of these addresses. And so that means that the people that own these addresses are like more limited in what they can do. I think there's ways around this, right? But this is, I guess, like a dangerous first step, at least for the privacy nerds out there, where it can be, you can be stopped in your freedom when you want to transact value across the world, which cannot happen, for example, with Bitcoin. Well, with Bitcoin, you can also flag, blacklist certain addresses, and then the next more interesting for me thing is that Circle, which is the company that controls, together with Coinbase, USDC, so the USDC stablecoin, actually blocked a number of addresses that were on these lists from transacting in USDC. So they have a blacklist. This is as far as I understand it. So they have a blacklist, and every transaction that happens with USDC the address from which the USDC is coming from, it's checked from the blacklist, and if the address is on the blacklist, you cannot transact. You cannot send the USDC, which means that essentially it's frozen. You can't do anything with it. You can't send it to an AMM. You can't send it to someone else. You can't sell it. You can't do anything with it. And so it means it's essentially like not worthless at that point.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. I found it interesting. I actually didn't realize that Circle and Tether both have this mechanism where they can blacklist addresses.
Well, at the end of the day, you don't actually control your tokens. So tokens and things in smart contracts, they exist in the smart contract. They don't exist outside of the smart contract. So you never actually own your own tokens. Like you have keys, you have the ability to sign transactions that interact with the smart contract, but ultimately the smart contract is the one that actually controls it. It's like, similar to, like, let's say I do all my transacting with a credit card through a bank, right? And the bank is the one actually sending money when I do the transaction. I'm not actually giving money to a merchant, right? The bank is on my behalf. And so that's like the smart contract. And so the smart contract or the bank can have functionality, and then it goes, nope, now you can't spend this money anymore. Your assets are frozen. And that is one of those things that I wish people understood better how tokens and NFTs worked. Because then we would focus more on better auditing contracts and spending more time understanding the people that are actually, maybe that not directly, but like a lot of smart contracts do have backdoor functionality where the administrator of the smart contract can do things. We think they're like, oh, this decentralized thing, this robot out there that controls everything for us and makes sure everything's neutral and fair. But realistically, a smart contract is just code. It can be coded however you want. I could literally put out a smart contract that goes, hey, I got a new token, everybody. And like, I could just have a rug function that literally just sends me just gives me all their money. Like there's nothing stopping any of that from happening. And following token standards isn't defining that you can't have a rug function. It's just, here's the functions you need to have to like be considered enough of the standard, but you could write whatever else you want. And that's like something I wish more people better understood, so that we didn't walk into these situations and go like, oh crap, someone else actually controls my USDC or my money or whatever. In theory, if I understand what the smart contract's doing, which most people won't.
But most smart contracts, you can design a smart contract in any which way you want, which means that if you, like, when you're saying like you don't actually control it, if the smart contract is controlled by only the owner of the asset, right? If there's no outside input into the smart contract of like an administrator that can stop like transactions, in practice or effectively, you really own the tokens.
The problem is though, right? you almost can't do smart contracts like that because you need to be able to upgrade them. And in order to upgrade them, you have to have a function that has like things like proxy contracts where you could say, okay, I'm going to redirect this code over to here because I need to do this updated code. And because of that, like at the end of the day, you can audit smart contracts all day long, but if no one's watching for proxy contract changes, like you don't know if it's changed. You don't know if the code's actually switched on you and now pointing somewhere else that now adds a rug function, right? And this is the thing that like, I think all this technology is awesome, but if we don't have people watchdogging it, like then we are just sleepwalking into a lot of problems.
So what's the solution here?
The solution is to have like actual standards that like audit this stuff, organizations that monitor it, that maybe we stake tokens in to fund them. I don't know. But basically we have people that their job is to watch. Then of course you got to have who watches the watchers and that whole thing, right? It becomes problematic. It's a trust network issue, and this is supposed to be a thing where we like, oh, we don't have to worry about trust because we've built it into the code, but like fundamentally the way smart contracts have to work, we think it's like, oh cool, we're building trust into it, but it's only true if you validate that trust.
There are some things that are pretty good about centralization, and I think that, like to Devin's point just now,
we don't say that
yeah here. I know but I'm allowed to, right? I think I'm probably the least crypto native of the three of us, working at a gaming fund, and my time is split between Web3 and traditional gaming. So, I hear these conversations thrown out quite a bit, especially when I don't have my Web3 hat on. But yeah, I think some of the funny things in blockchain world are eventually it almost feels like the model's going to come full circle, and that doesn't mean it's going to go back to what the traditional models are. But we talk about volatility in token prices, and will we eventually just move to stable coins? And we talk about centralization and watchdogs, and I think there will be variations and lessons that we've learned from the last hundreds or thousands of years that will maybe be applied to decentralization. But I think at times it does come kind of full circle in just
Fundamental
the way we
human
talk about it
problems.
feasibly.
Basically, right? It's just we can't solve for humanity with this. We're still kind of stuck with people being people, and so like I almost think of it rather than full circle. I think of it like a spiral where we kind of go in circles, like moving forward, sort of. But it's more like not a spiral, but like one of those like loop-de-loop kind of things going forward. And it's just it does end up kind of circular because like there was a reason those things existed in the first place to some extent, and so it's like there's parts of it that we're going to want to go back to. And parts we won't, and some of that can even be engineered. Honestly, like if you want to get conspiratorial, like people can try and engineer that move to that direction by purposely creating problems and other things that kind of push us towards that, back towards say centralization. Because I mean, you do see a bit of that with the money laundering thing, right? Like there's the classic stuff. If you want to smear any new technology, it's drugs, it's money laundering, it's terrorism, and it's like sex trafficking or pedophilia kind of stuff. You tag it with any of those things, and you can just automatically smear anything, right? It almost reminds me of like even like the communist witch hunt days, where you just call someone a commie, and it's like it's just the smear that instantly they're bad, and it's a problem. Like where we do have that sort of thing where we at the end of the day, as much as we would love for us to actually like set us free with all this crypto stuff, we still have to deal with real world governments. We still exist in a meat body for right now. Like we still have to do real world things. We have to fulfill Maslow's hierarchy and all that. And so like there's these fundamental problems that until those change, like we do have a bit of a structural like underpinning that we kind of have to go back to some extent. I just hope we don't end up worse off, that we end up better off, even if it's kind of similar.
Wait, Devin, did you just say we're still in a meat body for now?
Yes, I'm optimistic that I can escape this meat body.
Give me that USB stick that I plug into the back of my head.
Oh yeah,
man.
let's go, man.
Metaverse
I'm
Devin
all for
is
it.
ready to go.
I will do this podcast Max Headroom style from inside the Matrix, for sure.
Good. This doesn't like neatly tie us into the next topic. It doesn't really matter. So, Devin, want to talk about Splinterlands and their new plans?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like, I mean, I've talked up Splinterlands a few times that I think they're like a pretty smart company. They do a lot of pretty sound stuff when it comes to their economic design, or at least it's worked so far, even if it turns out to not be smart. And so they somehow, I don't know how the deal went down, right? Because there's not a lot of details on it, but they somehow ended up basically with a deal to make sports games using their current card game system. I don't know how much exactly they're going to like copy and paste, because I don't think everything about Splinterlands makes sense as a sports game, but there are certain elements of it that I could definitely see them kind of translating. And their schedule of when they're going to start releasing this stuff to me makes me think they're going to repurpose a lot. But basically the first deal, and it's through a company called One Team that is like brokering these deals with player organizations, is with Major League Soccer player organization. And so they are going to make a soccer game. Or football for you Europeans like Nico. And so in a way they're like competing a little bit with Sorare, but not necessarily, because Sorare is on the fantasy side of things, whereas this is, I think, going to be more of a battle game. So like a simulation kind of thing where it's like you have your players, and they've definitely indicated the players are going to have real stats, because the reason they're delaying pack launch till October is they need for the actual season to finish so they can collect real player stats. So there's definitely an indication that it will be like stat-driven thing. And I guess if things like FIFA Ultimate Team have shown us anything, people do like opening packs of cards for players. And I guess on that note, EA did say they're going to keep that for FIFA 2023, in case anyone was wondering. But it is very interesting, because they're not just trying to make this soccer game; they're also trying to do a sports ecosystem of a bunch of these games, kind of under the same umbrella. With like baseball, American football, just to distinguish it from soccer, and I think there was like one more, basketball, yeah. And it's interesting in general, I think, to see this trend of sports is actually one of the categories that does really well in blockchain in an unexpected way. And I think part of that's just because like part of the way people interact with sports is by collecting things and buying things. And so, I mean, it does make sense, but it is really interesting to see, because we think of this jocks versus nerds kind of thing sometimes, right? Where this kind of 80s or 90s dynamic that we still are like kind of left with a little bit, where we think, oh, the sports people aren't going to get into this. This is a tech nerd thing. But it seems like it's actually working out pretty well. You look at Dapper Labs, they're doing quite well. They just made a deal with the Rams to do a whole bunch of stuff with them as well for the season. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on in the sports world. I mean, So Rare released their MLB stuff, so you can do baseball and soccer now. just a lot happening with sports that seems to really jive, and it's one of those genres that I didn't expect to see take off this well. And I mean, we'll see how the Splinterlands one does. And it's called Genesis League Soccer, Genesis League, etc. Like, so the Genesis League ecosystem.
Interesting. So I have looked at 30 to 40 football or like sports related deals over the past 3-4 months. It's been insane, right? So many, right? You have like, Soccerverse that's building like an on-chain football manager, and then you have like games like Footium, and just way more, and it's just so many different ones. And this is actually like one of this illustrates one of the issues that I have as an investor, is that like I'm an esports dude, all right? I used to play a bit of football. I was terrible at it, and I've never really gotten into it. So like here in Belgium, football's huge, and I can give a shit, right? There's people like talking about it.
I'm with you, Nico.
Can we talk about something else, please? Anyway, so that stuff doesn't interest me, and then I'm looking at these deals. I really don't get excited about this stuff, but it seems to be working, right? There seems to be so many people really excited by this. I'm always impressed by what Sorarer's doing, and so yeah, it's crazy. But I still, like, in the back of my head, something keeps nagging to me, like, this is too skeuomorphic, and I think it might bring a bunch of people onto the blockchain, but I don't think like the big unlock is I believe somewhere else.
Probably.
Yeah, I can second the fact that I've seen probably close to 100 combined sports games, racing games,
but they're all going to be the first, right?
Yes, they're all the first at something. No, but I mean I agree with Nico. It is really interesting, and it is a hard challenge to differentiate dozens of different projects that are almost like incrementally different from each other, and it's like, which incremental difference is going to drive success? Like, is the next So Rare significantly different than So Rare, or does it just do something slightly different that captures attention, and is the timing just perfectly right? But yeah, I mean, I'm maybe not the target audience for all of those, but I think that's where the real challenge is.
I think that's what makes the Splinterlands one
here.
So much more interesting, because it's not just some random pitch deck, right? Like it's a company that's proven at least some level of success, and they've proven they can do partnerships with the Warner Music deal. Like they've proven they can at least do some things competently, right? Yeah. And so it's a question of whether or not this ends up truly being in their wheelhouse or not. And I think realistically, like I've played, like I don't necessarily, I'm not into physical sports either, but I have played some really interesting like card-based sports simulation games on, say, mobile over time. I can't remember what they're called. It was Big Something, but there was like a series of them, and I thought it was actually pretty fun. Like, just this idea of like you have these different cards, these different players, and different like abilities and stuff, and you can kind of like set up your team and then let it play out and kind of watch it. And that's exactly what Splinterlands is, right? You have your cards, you build your team, you watch it run, and you kind of like adjust and try to do things differently the next time. And so I think that actually that loop works out pretty well for their particular skills. And so I think, honestly, I probably would play this even if I don't care about the actual sports behind it. As opposed to So Rare, which, like, I play out of curiosity, but I'm never really going to get super into it because I don't have any emotional attachment to the players or the teams or anything like that. And like you said, Nico, I'd be more interested in the esports side of things. I do like the esports sim kind of ones, but there's so few of those. I expect we will see more of those on the esports side too as well. I don't think it'll be limited to just physical sports, but it is a little bit different in how they work. But like overall, I think, like you said, this isn't the big unlock, but I do think there's some fit for sure. And like if you go back to the actual origins of trading card games, right? And like I've said this a million times before, but trading card games are a great fit for blockchain, or NFTs at least, right? Just because they make a lot of sense. And if you go back to where Magic the Gathering, the original trading card game, came from, it was two things. It was baseball cards or whatever, like trading cards for sports stuff, combined with this idea of like I think it was called Stratomatic baseball or something, Statomatic or something like that. It was basically a stat-based baseball simulation system where you could kind of play sort of simulated baseball using stats, because baseball people are big stats nerds for some reason. It's like it's a thing with baseball, right? And so like there is like this audience, this demographic that sort of like fits in with that, and this sort of fit that is natural to it. Like I don't think it's going to blow up and be a huge thing, but I do think it has legs over time overall, just because at least for this phase of blockchain gaming that there's some fit. Even if it doesn't blow up into like a giant, like the way FIFA is for EA kind of thing, or was, I guess.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm curious, but I'm sure that there's the real world where next year it's like, oh, blockchain was useful for sports, and that's
right.
like how we get the next 5 million players into this stuff. So I get it, man. I know here in Belgium, and I think it's maybe not a US thing, but here we have like Panini cards.
Well, Panini's still like successful somewhat over here, I think, but
yeah, I know. And
yeah.
It's probably that thing is the main reason why like blockchain is actually gaining traction with like NBA Top Shot and stuff. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, next, I think the next big topic that we can still discuss, we don't have that much time left, is so I woke up, I looked into the Fogged Out Discord, and I saw like 75 messages, all of which have half a book.
Intense.
So Devin, what happened?
I know like 75% of those messages were me.
Ranting about.
I need to stop hitting the enter key after every sentence, I guess. I'm used to IRC where you've got to like talk quickly, and so it was. Yeah. Like we get into these discussions quite often, I think, in there, which is always interesting to me, which is often around this idea of like NFT ownership and like interoperability and stuff like that, because this is a topic I think about a lot, and I think is a really, really interesting area to explore. And I've noticed that like conversations tend to kind of go past each other a little bit, depending on like how you define things and what you're actually talking about. Like, because often like we lump a lot of stuff together into this big amorphous thing of like NFTs and ownership, and we often don't get into the nitty gritty details of what we're actually talking about. And so like I ended up kind of taking this thing where I'm like, one distinction that I don't think people often make is like, what are kind of the parts of an NFT that apply to ownership or don't apply to ownership or interoperability? And I think like dissecting it and pulling apart these things a little bit more, I think helps us talk about like what elements make sense and what don't. So what I ended up kind of breaking it down to was like, and I used kind of a magic card as an example, just because like visually it has all the components like laid out on it, because it's a singular modular piece of information in the way kind of an NFT can be. But it's like there's interesting components like identification, which is like how do you identify that NFT? And there's like two kinds. There's like the semi-fungible kind, where it's like you can have a bunch of copies of this one thing, but it's still identified as that one thing. And then there's like the totally non-fungible kind, where it's like here's the unique ID. Right, so those are the two different kinds of identifications. Like, what would you call this thing, and like, what is this thing numbered if it has a unique number, right? And then there was like, okay, well, there's also the data, right? Like, what is the data that actually is like the metadata, whether that be like attributes or other things like that, the kind of data that we use to process, like the kind of things the computer would do stuff with, right? And then it was like the representation, like what's the image, what's the 3D model, what's the animation, what's the sound, like how do we represent this thing to humans outside of like a database or like looking at Blockchain Explorer, and then that's pretty like replaceable, right? And then there's the idea of also like the context, like where you use it matters as well, and that may or may not be part of the NFT. Like you may have like some contextual elements as part of it, but overall that often exists outside of it, and often outside of the blockchain altogether. And so this idea of like where we ended up with this discussion where like the identification part should definitely be part of NFTs and definitely on the chain, right? Because that's what the blockchain's good for, is keeping track of unique or even semi-unique items. And you have to have that identifier. There's like, you can't have a database without some kind of like ID field, right? So that part's essential. But then you start to look at parts like representation. It's like, well, that part doesn't matter so much, right? Because, right-click save, I guess you could make that. But there's also the idea that like you could represent the same object differently, right? You could have different art styles for it. You could have different, like a 2D image, but then it's rendered in a 3D version. Like I've seen lots of startups trying to do 3D renderings of like a Bored Ape or whatever. And so representation is totally malleable. And so that doesn't necessarily need to be on the blockchain, but that doesn't lead to interesting debates about like ownership when that isn't on the blockchain, right? Like that you get those arguments like, well, it just points to an image and that image could change on that server. And so you don't even really own that image because that's not part of the blockchain. That's not part of the NFT. And then the context as well, like you have no control over the context for the most part. And that was like going to some of Raf Koster's discussions. I think it was the discussion with Aaron, or it might have been another one he was having, but he was pointing out that the context really mattered, and trying to separate the context out is part of what made it so tricky. Like when you talk about like, oh, I'm going to take a sword from this game over to this game, right? But the context of where that sword made sense in that game was also like a big part of it, but not something that's represented anywhere within the sword. And so it's you can't put that on the chain. And so like there's these different elements, and that's why I wanted to break it up, because some elements make a lot more sense, some don't. And so when we talk about interoperability, it's like, well, what parts are you talking about?
That's fair. It's an interesting discussion. I've recently spoken to an entrepreneur who is looking to build like NFT standards specifically for game assets, where the metadata of the NFT and would like include a lot more than you currently have, right? So instead of linking to an image, it's literally like you get enough data in the metadata to like represent it within different types of engines. Could be Unreal, could be Unity, like one of the cool things that they were working on was also like having more of the so essentially right now most NFT items are like the item lives on chain. The metadata of the NFT is static, which means like you can have a a land plot that is on XY coordinate that has like this type of like biome or whatever, right? And so what they're doing is actually like have more of the. So for example, if you would have a piece of armor has can like as it's being used, as it's being hit, it actually loses. What is it? Like what's the term that they use
durability?
when your assets actually lose quality?
Yeah,
durability. That's the word. Yeah. Thank you. So exactly. So as you use it, it loses durability, and so they're working on a standard to actually like have that durability level out of a percentage, whatever, represented like tracked on chain. So what I'm saying is this. I think these discussions about what is like an NFT in a game asset, like what does it represent, I think they're useful. But I do think like I live in a world where all of these things, like more and more of the representation and how it's being used like moves on. Like I think we're gonna like find solutions for all these problems, and this is more temporary
solutions. Yeah, like loot going to your particular taste there, Nico. I thought was an interesting example that got brought up as well, because it's one that's designed purposely leaving out representation and context. Like it actually purposely omitted those things and said like, well, the blockchain's good for storing data and an identifier, and ignoring, we don't care about representation, we don't care about context, you bring those things to it. And I thought that was particularly interesting in terms of looking at something that became flexible because it omitted those things and didn't force those. Because sometimes, like, and some people were talking about this, where it becomes very hard to separate representation or context out of a thing because the data part is designed with that in mind. Whereas loot was designed the opposite, where it was like, we don't care about that, so like do what you want with it. And it designed it in a more agnostic way. And maybe we need to start looking at different kinds of, like, do we want an NFT that is very prescriptive of how it's meant to be used? Or do we want some generic ones? And maybe there's, like some split there. Like maybe we do want some, primitive NFTs that are purposely built like loot to be used in repurposed and composed and stuff like that. And don't have like more specific things like decay tracked on them and stuff like that. And then there's ones that are like, hey, this is pretty much for this game. If you want to use this elsewhere, it's like trading cards, right? Where you can kind of play with trading cards however you want. You can make up house rules or whatever. Like I literally used to like just back before Marvel actually had card games, I would just take the Marvel cards and we'd just kind of make up a game around it. Like, oh, this guy would actually beat this guy in the comics, so therefore I win that battle. Like you could come up with games for it. But when the card games started getting very prescriptive, like what's on the card, the stats, the details, the mechanics, it gets a little harder to house rule around that, to kind of like be more flexible because all that data is there. And so you kind of end up in this weird place where you're like, we want to make this super useful in this game, but then we have to get very specific, and then it's less useful elsewhere. And I think the deeper we get into these ideas of interoperability and people trying to do more and more of that, the more we need to look at like these different distinctions and points and where we want to be on that spectrum between, say, loot and a trading card.
Yeah, and even outside of interoperability, I thought one of the more interesting parts of that conversation was also around the data needing to be malleable just for the sake of balancing one single game, where as you're introducing new items over time, if you accidentally overpower an item, put it into the game, and there's the data of basically the power of that item is set in stone, you're basically going to have to kind of give up the fact that everything else historically is just inferior and kind of do future balance. So it is a risky game to not have the traits be malleable for that reason, where one mistake can kind of break a game.
Well, like to that point, even like that the point of all that too was digging at the idea of ownership. Like, do you own the data itself to where it can't be changed without your permission, for example? And it's like and that led to the conversation of context, where it's like, what you control might be the item, but you don't control the context. Like for the example I was giving was like trading cards, right? Well, they can't enforce what you do with your trading cards at your kitchen table, but they can enforce how you use them in a tournament, right? So that context is one that they control, whereas your home is one where they don't. And I do think we need that availability to have that sort of thing, because right now we don't have that on the blockchain. We don't have the kitchen table. We just have the tournament part, right? Yeah. We just have the games where it's controlled. And so the idea is like, to your point, let's say there's an item and it's unbalanced and it needs to be changed. Well, the game can go, you know what? That particular item is banned in the game for these tournament modes or whatever. However, if you want, we will exchange your old broken version for a new fixed version, and therefore, like they're sort of striking a balance where they're saying you can keep your old thing if you want, but if you want to play in our thing, you need to use this version of it. And maybe they don't even like literally exchange it. They just go, as long as you own that old one, you also get a copy of like the fixed one. And it's sort of like a digital version of like a card errata, where like they print something that says like, hey, actually read the card this way, which is something that happens in TCGs a lot, where the tournament organizer or the card manufacturer, it's too expensive for them to reprint the card. So they just have to put out a thing, say like a bulletin or a thing to all the tournament organizers to say like, well, from now on, like read the card this way, or like you need to like make this slight change to it, or they'll say like you can only have one copy of that card now instead of 4. So like there's different ways to address that issue, and I found that really interesting that there's like all these different ways that trading card games have already done, and I'm sure there's other things that other people have done, but like in just even that one sphere has dealt with this problem for so long and tried different things. And you see like the digital people trying to do it as well, where they go, okay, like I think it was Gods Unchained or one of these other trading card games that does a weird sort of promise window where they say like for the first 60 days or 90 days, whatever it is, like there's a window in which they're allowed to change the card for balance purposes, like kind of treating it almost like it's a beta version of the card. And so the reason they do that is to go like, hey, don't overinvest in this card if it's super powerful, because we might nerf it. Like that's part of the thing, is you don't want people to like overbuy it thinking they're buying power. But then, like, after that window is over, it's locked in stone. And they have to do other things to balance the game. And so, like, there's little interesting trade-offs. But it is a really important discussion. It's like, what rights do we get as part of our ownership?
100%. Good. We're almost at an hour, so we're going to have to cut this short. We had some micro topics prepared. We can always keep those for next episode.
Too much ranting for me.
Right, so...
Too much ranting from me.
Yeah, man. It's all you. Anyway, good rants. We like rants here. Rants are fun. So, good. Devin, Phil, thanks for joining. Listener, thanks for listening. If you haven't already joined the FogDAO, we're going to be more and more, or less and less lenient. No, more lenient when it comes to applications. So, soon it'll be fully open. And if you're in now, then you'll be an OG FogDAOer. And if you're not yet in, then better hurry. Or you better hurry. Good. If you enjoyed, let us know. Get into that FogDAO Discord, and let's speak to you next week.